A line of German soldiers stands against a coal yard wall, hands raised, weapons already surrendered. An American soldier steps forward with a machine gun. He doesn't wait for an order. He doesn't ask a question. He doesn't hesitate the way training says a disciplined soldier should when facing men who've already given up. He opens fire. That's the scene. Not the gates opening. Not the newsreel footage of skeletal survivors cheering behind barbed wire that's been replayed for 80 years. This is the moment right before that footage was shot, the one most documentaries leave out entirely, because it complicates a story that's supposed to end with the good guys simply winning. On April 29th, 1945, the same soldiers who liberated Dachau also, within the same few hours, turned their weapons on men who had already surrendered. And for the rest of the century, almost nobody wanted to talk about why. To understand what happened that morning, you have to understand what these particular soldiers had already walked through to get there. By late April of 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing fast, and the men of the 45th and 42nd Infantry Divisions pushing into Bavaria weren't green recruits seeing combat for the first time. They'd fought through North Africa, through Sicily, through the brutal stalemate at Anzio, and through months of grinding advance across a collapsing Germany. And in the weeks just before Dachau, they'd already seen things that were supposed to be beyond what any training could prepare a person for. American troops had liberated Ohrdruf on April 4th, and Buchenwald a week later. General Eisenhower himself toured Ohrdruf that month and ordered every unit within marching distance to walk through it in person on the theory that someday people would try to claim none of it had ever happened, and soldiers who'd seen it with their own eyes would be the only answer to that. So by the time these men approached Dachau, on the outskirts of Munich, they weren't walking in blind. They thought they knew, in a general sense, what a liberated camp would look like. They didn't, and the gap between what they expected and what they found is exactly what set the rest of that morning in motion. Before they even reached the gates, soldiers came across a railway spur just outside the perimeter wall, several dozen boxcars sitting in the spring sun, doors open. At first, some of them thought the cars were full of laundry, sacks of something soft piled up against each other. They climbed up to look closer. What they found instead was close to 2,000 bodies, people who had been evacuated from other camps as the German lines fell apart, packed into cars meant for cargo and left there to starve, suffocate, or freeze during a journey that had gone nowhere. Some of them had clearly still been alive when the doors were sealed shut. Soldiers who found that train describe it, even decades later, as the exact moment something in them changed. Not fear, something closer to a switch flipping, quietly, with no one giving an order. That's the state of mind these men carried with them through the gates minutes later. Not calm professionalism, not procedure. A kind of controlled rage with nowhere yet to go. And it kept building as they walked deeper into the camp itself. Near the crematorium, bodies were stacked in piles taller than a man, the camp's capacity to process the dead having long since collapsed under the sheer number of people dying in the final weeks alone, as typhus tore through a population already starved past the point of recovery. The prisoners, still alive, were barely alive, thousands of them reduced to skeletal frames, some too weak to stand, crowding the fences to see the soldiers, cheering in a dozen languages, some of them dying in the hours after liberation simply because their bodies could no longer process food after years of near starvation. For the Americans walking through, the abstract idea of Nazi atrocity they'd heard about for years suddenly had a smell, a temperature, a sound. It stopped being a briefing. It kept being in front of them, barracks after barracks, for as long as they kept walking. And somewhere in the middle of that walk, they started encountering German personnel who were still in the camp. A mix of Waffen-SS guards, camp administrators, and men from other units pulled in during the final collapse of the front. Some of them tried to fight. Most didn't. Most raised their hands. Exactly the way soldiers are trained to expect will keep them alive under the laws of war both sides had agreed to. None of it mattered. Not the raised hands, not the training both armies had, in theory, agreed to respect. Not even the fact that many of these men weren't hardened killers themselves, but administrators, clerks, and reservists swept into guard duty during the camp's final chaotic weeks. At a coal yard near the camp's maintenance buildings, a group of German soldiers who had surrendered were lined up against a wall. Accounts differ on exactly how it started. Some soldiers say an American opened fire without orders. Others describe a scuffle, a prisoner grabbing for a weapon, the shooting spiraling outward from there within seconds. What multiple witnesses agree on is the outcome. A machine gun was turned on the line of men, and by the time it stopped, more than a dozen lay dead or dying against the coal bin wall. Some historians place the number at that location alone at 17, and it wasn't the only place it happened that day. An American officer on the ground, Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, is documented in later accounts as the man who physically stopped the shooting before it went further, firing his own pistol into the air, ordering his men to cease fire, then kicking the gunner off the weapon and hauling him back by the collar so it couldn't be fired again. Whether that intervention came in time to save any lives, or only stopped the killing from claiming more, Depends on which account you read. What isn't in dispute is that for some stretch of that morning, officers who had led these men competently for months had genuinely lost control of them. The coal yard wasn't the only scene, and it wasn't even the first. Before soldiers had gone very far into the camp at all, a smaller group of German guards approached an American position with their hands raised, surrendering near the railway spur where the boxcars sat. According to accounts that survive, an officer ordered several of them into one of the empty cars and shot them himself with his pistol before anyone else in the unit had even reached the coal yard. Other soldiers scattered through the camp carried out shootings of their own that same morning. A guard shot in a watchtower after raising his hands, prisoners of war killed in 2s and 3s by men who drifted off from any real chain of command, the line between a legitimate target and a surrendered man simply dissolving for them somewhere in the space of that morning. Inside the camp itself, newly freed prisoners turned on the capos, the prisoner functionaries who had helped run the camp's daily brutality on the SS's behalf, and beat some of them to death with their bare hands, American soldiers standing by and, in some documented cases, doing nothing to stop it, agreeing quietly that these particular men had it coming. By the time anyone with real authority regained full control, and it took hours, not minutes, historians estimate that somewhere between 36 and more than 50 German personnel had been killed after they were no longer any kind of threat, not in combat, after surrender, disarmed, on the ground. Here's the part that should stop you cold. None of this happened at gunpoint under enemy fire. None of it happened in the fog of an active firefight, where split-second decisions are unavoidable and forgivable by almost any standard. This happened in the minutes and hours after German soldiers had already given up, inside a camp that was, by that point, functionally already liberated. Under the exact laws of war the United States had signed, the same Geneva Conventions America would spend the rest of that year invoking to prosecute Nazi officers for war crimes. Executing a disarmed man who has surrendered isn't justice. It's a crime. The same category of crime America was simultaneously building an entire international tribunal to punish less than 7 months later in a courtroom in Nuremberg. Testimony collected from soldiers who were there that morning shows just how split their own reactions were, even standing feet apart from one another, watching the same men raise their hands. One lieutenant, documented in later accounts as Harold Moyer, said that every man in the outfit who'd seen those boxcars felt justified handing out death as punishment to the men responsible for it. Not regret, not hesitation. A kind of moral certainty that what happened next was simply the war settling its own accounts. But not everyone in that unit felt that way, and their objections are just as much a part of the record. One corporal, remembered as Henry Mills, is documented saying something close to the opposite, that they'd crossed an ocean to stop exactly this kind of thing. And now, here they were, doing a version of it themselves. Another officer present, a lieutenant named Drain, reportedly said flatly that this wasn't the American way of fighting. 3 men, standing roughly where the same events unfolded, arriving at 3 completely different verdicts about what they'd just watched. The split didn't resolve that day. In a lot of ways, it still hasn't, not for historians, and not for the descendants of the men who were there. Consider the timing, because it matters. The next day, April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler killed himself in a bunker under Berlin as Soviet troops closed in on the city, roughly 300 miles to the north. The war that had produced Dachau, that had produced the boxcar of corpses and the coal yard and everything else that happened that morning, was ending in real time, within the same 48 hours. The soldiers doing the shooting weren't fighting some abstract, distant evil out of a history book. They were standing in the middle of its final collapse, close enough to see it end with no idea yet that it already had. So what happened next? Once the shooting finally stopped and someone higher up the chain found out, word reached command within days, and the 7th Army's Inspector General opened a formal investigation almost immediately. This wasn't buried the moment it happened. An officer was assigned to interview soldiers, one by one, some of them still visibly shaken by what they had witnessed and done just days earlier, along with officers and former prisoners who'd seen the shootings from inside the wire. The finished report didn't soften what it found. It named specific soldiers believed to have a case to answer under military law, not vague blame spread across an entire unit. Dozens of killings in total, flagged as potential war crimes across the boxcars, the coal yard, and the watchtower. On paper, this was a case moving in exactly the direction military law required. And then, almost nothing happened. Not one soldier was ever court-martialed for what took place at Dachau that morning. General George Patton, recently appointed military governor of the American occupation zone in Bavaria, personally chose to dismiss the charges against the men named in that investigation, not a colonel quietly slow-walking a file somewhere down the chain of command. Patton himself at the very top of it. He was, by that point, already a controversial figure among occupation authorities. He'd lose his command that same year over public comments defending the retention of former Nazi Party members in administrative jobs, arguing that denazification was, in his own words, getting in the way of simply running post-war Bavaria. The men he cleared were never tried, and their names were never publicly cleared either. They went home decorated as liberators, which, by every measure that actually counts, freeing tens of thousands of people from a death camp, they also genuinely were. The Army's own legal reasoning for closing the case survives, on paper, in the words of the officer who reviewed it later that year. There was, in his own written words, a violation of the letter of international law, and that guards seemed to have been shot without trial. A violation, in writing, from the Army's own legal office, and then, in the very next breath, the reason nothing would be done about it. Given what the first combat troops to reach Dachau had just seen with their own eyes, it wasn't believed that justice demanded the difficult, perhaps impossible task of fixing individual responsibility. Translated out of the legal language, yes, this was a war crime. No, we're not going to find out who exactly did it. That single conclusion is the entire cover-up, admitted in the Army's own file, and it sat untouched for decades before a researcher eventually pulled it out of the National Archives. That's the part of this story that resists a clean verdict. And it's worth sitting in that discomfort instead of rushing past it toward an easy answer. These weren't men who woke up that morning planning to commit a war crime. They were men who had spent years fighting an enemy that had just shown them in the span of a single hour exactly what it had been doing behind its own lines the entire time. A boxcar of corpses, a crematorium stacked with bodies, thousands of people reduced to skeletons for the crime of existing. It's not hard to understand how discipline broke that morning. Understanding it, though, isn't the same question as whether it was lawful or whether it should have been prosecuted the same way any other execution of a surrendered soldier would have been under the exact rules America was about to enforce on the other side of the same war. And that's the real question sitting underneath this entire story, so here it is directly. If executing a man after he's already surrendered is a war crime when a Nazi officer gives the order, and the United States spent the following year building an entire legal system at Nuremberg around exactly that principle, does it stop being a war crime the moment the men holding the rifles have just walked through the worst thing they've ever seen in their lives? Or is that precisely the situation the laws of war were written for in the first place? Because rage and justification are always going to feel completely airtight to the people holding the weapons in the moment it happens. Nobody is asking you to condemn soldiers who'd spent the morning staring at 2,000 corpses inside a train. The question is where you draw the line, and whether an army gets to investigate itself, conclude in its own words that its own men broke the law, and then simply decide not to do anything about it. Put your answer in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of question this channel exists to sit with, not the easy history, the uncomfortable kind. What happened to the official memory of that morning tells its own story. For decades, the reprisal killings barely existed in the public narrative of Dachau's liberation. The version that got told, in newsreels and textbooks, was the clean one. Gates open, prisoners saved, evil defeated, credits roll. That version isn't false. Tens of thousands of people who were alive at the end of that day are alive today because American soldiers put themselves between that camp and a war still collapsing around them, and nothing about the coal yard or the boxcars changes that. But the clean version left something out, and it left it out for the same reason the legal memo did, because nobody with the standing to correct the record ever chose to. Felix Sparks, the officer who stopped the coal yard shooting before it claimed more lives, never described that morning as heroism when he spoke about it in later interviews. He called it damage control, a small act of restoring order inside something that had already gone further than any of them could undo. The men who carried it out weren't looking for credit. If anything, silence suited most of them fine, since talking about it meant reliving a morning they'd rather forget. Dachau wasn't an isolated case either. Historians studying the liberation of other camps in that same final month of the war have documented similar breakdowns along the advancing Allied lines. Guards shot after surrendering, discipline collapsing in the minutes after soldiers first saw what a camp actually contained. Dachau's case is simply the best documented of all of them, because the original investigation happened to survive intact, enough for later historians to reconstruct exactly what happened and exactly what didn't. Those parallel cases rarely made it into official records at all, which is part of why Dachau's remains the reference point every historian returns to. There's a specific irony worth naming plainly. In the very same year, American prosecutors were building the meticulous, admissible case against German officers that would become Nuremberg, the birthplace of the modern rule that following orders is never a defense. The United States Army was quietly declining to hold its own soldiers to that same standard, for shootings witnessed by dozens of people on both sides and documented in its own internal report. Dachau's own file suggests that rule had a very specific address, and it wasn't Washington. The file itself stayed sealed inside the National Archives for 46 years. It surfaced only in 1991 when a researcher finally pulled it out. The first time the public learned the Army had written down, in its own words, that a crime occurred and then chosen not to find out who was responsible for it. Even after the file surfaced, no formal reassessment of Patton's decision ever took place. The Army confirmed what happened without ever revisiting whether it had been right to let it go. Once the file surfaced, historians didn't rewrite Dachau's story completely, but they filled in what had been missing for 2 generations. Survivors' accounts that had described the killings for decades, often dismissed as rumor or exaggeration, were suddenly backed by the Army's own paperwork. The soldiers named in the original 1945 investigation were, by then, elderly or already dead, so no prosecution followed the discovery because none was any longer possible. For the families of the men who were shot in that boxcar and at that coal yard wall, the discovery meant something too, an acknowledgement, however delayed, that what happened to their relatives had been recorded, disputed, and quietly set aside, rather than simply forgotten by history's accident. None of this erases what those soldiers accomplished that day. They walked into one of the most horrifying places human beings have ever built, and they ended it that same afternoon with their own hands and their own risk. Tens of thousands of people alive today trace their existence directly to that morning. But the men who liberated Dachau and the men who executed prisoners against a coal yard wall were, in a number of documented cases, the exact same men, within the same few hours, and the country that sent them there chose, for 46 years, to remember only one half of that. That choice wasn't made by soldiers standing in front of a boxcar of corpses with their discipline in pieces. It was made afterward, by officers with the paperwork and the distance to pick the easier story. Dachau's liberation earned its place in history. What happened in the hours after, it did not earn the silence it received, and the only reason anyone knows the difference today is that one investigator wrote the truth down in 1945, and one researcher went looking for it in 1991. If you want more of this kind of history, subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.